In almost all the applications we build, we have a common need to store and retrieve the information of business data from a proper store, like databases or file systems. The repository pattern is going to help us with this need. The repository purpose is to encapsulate all the logic needed to obtain object reference from the final store. The domain objects won't have to deal with the infrastructure to get the needed reference to other objects of the domain. You should create repositories only for aggregates that actually needs direct access. So be careful when defining your repositories and ensure that each repository is going to be used or needed. When you are defining the repository interface and implementation, make that interface and implementation behave as an in-memory collection or as a persistent database. We are going to talk more about this in short. Finally, try to use the repositories only in the application layer. Try to avoid using them inside aggregates, and if you need to do that, then do not use dependency injection to load the repository inside the aggregate. It is better to load the repository in the application layer and implement the double dispatch pattern to use the repository. Okay, it is almost all clear about repositories. The only pending detail is to explain the meaning of make the repository behave as an in-memory collection or as a persistent database. Let's start talking about in-memory collection repositories. This kind of repository tries to simulate a collection. To be more explicit, we want the repository to behave as a set. In general, if you use collections to store objects, you only add, get, and remove objects from the collection. Note that we don't need to save the object again if we take it from the set and then we modified it. And also, in particular from the set behavior, we are interested in the feature of not allowing duplicate objects. So, the idea to have a repository simulating a collection is not just have an interface with the same methods like add all, remove, or remove all. It should mimic a collection. So, whatever the framework you use to implement the repository, you must not allow instances of the same object to be added twice. And also, when retrieving the objects from the repository and modifying them, you don't need to resave the object again. The repository should automatically track the changes in the object and update the final store when the transaction finishes. Here we have an example of how the in-memory collection interface should be. As you can see, we do not have a save method. We only have methods to add all, remove, and remove all. And of course, we should have proper methods to find the object. Now let's talk about the persistent database repositories. If you cannot have an in-memory collection repository because of technical restrictions, then you need to use a persistent database repository. This kind of repository is common when you are using an in-memory or a NoSQL database. You should also use this kind of repository when you are planning to change to a NoSQL database in the future. In this kind of repositories, if you get objects from the repository and update them, then you need to explicitly call the save method to reflect the change. This is the main difference with the in-memory collection repository. We do not need any magic mechanisms to track the changes on an object to save it in the final store. Here we have an example on how an interface for this kind of repository should be. Perfect. Let's see all of this in a concrete example checking one of the repositories in our solution. We have selected the use of a repository that behaves as a persistent database. First, we have defined our base repository interface. We are going to use a persistent database repository, so this is the repository interface all repositories should use. Next, we have created the card repository. Note that we have included two new methods, one to generate the ID of the card and other to find a card for a particular customer. As we are using a Spring Data JPA with Hibernate, we have created the JPA repository interface. And finally, we have created an implementation for our card repository. and we use the JPL repository interface to implement each one of the methods.